I'm Bob Zimmer, I'm president of the University of Chicago, and it is a great honor and privilege for us to welcome the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, to the University of Chicago as the keynote speaker for the Institute of Politics' 5th anniversary celebration. We're particularly pleased that the Prime Minister chose to come here to the Institute of Politics to speak to our students and our community about the importance of public service, of which, of course, he is a wonderful exemplar. One of our students who is deeply involved in the Institute of Politics will formally give some background on Prime Minister Trudeau and make a formal introduction in a few moments. But I want to preface that by not only expressing my gratitude to Prime Minister Trudeau, but saying something about the context in which he is here. It's now 5 years since David Axelrod opened the Institute of Politics here on campus in January of 2013. From its original conception to its early days and to this very moment, the nonpartisan Institute of Politics has sought to ignite in young people a passion for politics and public service and what it can enable them to achieve. In that framework, David Axelrod and the Institute of Politics have sought to greatly enrich campus discourse on a wide variety of public issues. It is a tribute to David, his vision, and his commitment that the Institute of Politics has become a very important feature of the University of Chicago campus. It's done so in a wide variety of ways. Via its speaker series, the Institute has brought to campus over 1,000 guests, including Joe Biden, Mitt Romney, Elena Kagan, John Kerry, Alicia Garza, Paul Ryan, Bernie Sanders, and others. Via its Pritzker Fellows programs, the Institute has hosted 98 fellows on campus, and via its internship programs, the Institute has supported over 1,000 fully funded student internships around the world and launched its annual Summer in Washington program. Via its civic engagement program, the Institute has helped over 500 students participate in student-led civic engagement projects such as Women in Public Service, which seeks to empower undergraduate women at the university to pursue careers in the political arena, and The Gate, the university's undergraduate political review. The Institute's reach has stretched far beyond campus. It has led student trips to Cuba, Indonesia, China, and the Democratic and Republican conventions. It is connected to the now internationally renowned podcast, The Axe Files, where David Axelrod has intimate conversations with guests such as President Obama, Madeleine Albright, and John McCain. As has been observed by many, our national political conversation is sorely in need of serious and engaged discourse on fundamental issues where those with legitimate but differing perspectives can try to find common ground for action. It is too often that this discourse degenerates quickly into demonization of others and abrupt dismissal of those with opposing views. It is one of the great accomplishments of the Institute that it has demonstrated that even in these challenging times, that our political discourse can in fact be elevated, and that serious discourse and engagement with a wide variety of political views is possible and productive. It is all of this and more that makes the Institute such a unique offering, as you see with young fans as well, such a unique offering across American universities, complementing the academic studies of our students by giving them hands-on opportunities to become involved in politics and public service and try to bring about the changes that they seek. I'm deeply grateful to David Axelrod, both as president of the University of Chicago and personally, that upon leaving the world of political campaigns full-time, he chose to focus his efforts here at his alma mater to inspire students to believe that they too can have an impact on the world through politics and public service. Caroline Hutton, a fourth year at the college majoring in public policy, is one of those students. Her first year on campus, Caroline joined the Women in Public Service program, a group that she now chairs. Last summer, she had an IOP internship with the State Department, and this year she is the senior chair of the Institute's Student Advisory Board. It is my pleasure to welcome Caroline Hutton to the podium to introduce our honored guest, Prime Minister Trudeau. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Zimmer, and welcome everyone. In the hours after the 2016 election, so many Americans Googled Canadian immigration policies that the server overloaded and the website crashed. The first place people looked to was our neighbor to the north. And that shouldn't come as a surprise. Canada has been our friend and ally for decades. We share more than just a border, a language, the Great Lakes, and trade. We also share an unwavering commitment to democracy, to human rights, and to respect for the individual. In so many ways, Canada has come to provide a model of democratic values. And at the helm of that model is their Prime Minister and our special guest today, Justin Trudeau. Justin Pierre Trudeau's political experience started early as the son of then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Margaret Sinclair. He grew up primarily in Ottawa, graduated from McGill, pursued a degree in education, and spent several years teaching in Vancouver, reaffirming a deep dedication to and belief in Canada's young people early in his career. That dedication and belief was evident years later when, in 2013, Trudeau was elected as leader of the Liberal Party. His campaign sparked a new wave of Canadian progressivism, promoting equal economic opportunity, respect for diversity, civic engagement, and the promotion of democracy. He won in a landslide, earning 80% of the vote. 2 years later, Trudeau led the Liberal Party to victory, earning 184 seats in Parliament and propelling him to the position of Canada's second youngest Prime Minister in the history of the country. During his tenure, he's made progress on a range of policy issues, including working towards increased economic equity, repairing relations with Canada's Indigenous populations, and continuing to combat climate change. He also established a new Prime Minister's Youth Council and appointed the country's first gender-balanced cabinet. As you may know, the Institute of Politics is celebrating its fifth anniversary this year. Every single thing we do at the IOP goes back to our mission of wanting to inspire young people to go into public service, and I cannot think of a better embodiment of that than our guest for tonight's anniversary celebration. Prime Minister Trudeau sets an extraordinary example of the power in public service, in progressivism, and in young people, and it's an honor to welcome him to Chicago. He will first provide remarks and then be joined on stage by David Axelrod, the founder and director of the Institute of Politics. And with that, please join me in wishing a happy 5th birthday to the Institute of Politics. Bienvenue à Chicago, Monsieur Trudeau.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Caroline, for that warm introduction. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for including me here today in this 5th anniversary celebration of the Institute of Politics. And thank you, all of you, for your interest in politics and public policy and civic engagement. It's something that is really important. I obviously think so, but I have to admit that when I was a kid, I wasn't particularly interested in politics, and through my entire university career, I stayed as far away as I could from any political science class. So congratulations to all of you for sticking with it. Of course, as Caroline pointed out, I sort of grew up surrounded by politics. My father was Prime Minister for the first 13 years of my life. And on my mother's side, well, her father had been a cabinet minister and a politician for a couple of decades, well before I came along. So I had an early exposure to politics in two very different ways. My father was a very intellectual. He was a professor of law. He had a very academic approach to the big challenges that we were being faced in politics in his time. My grandfather was much more of a classic people person, a gregarious politician who loved working the doors and connecting with people. But both of them, and my mother as well, raised me with a deep sense of responsibility. And I think that's one of the only the ways I could make sense of the ridiculous good luck that I was born with and raised around. I got to go to great schools. I got to grow up in an amazing home in an environment where my father regularly had heads of state and kings and queens over for lunch and dinner, and I got to exchange and meet amazing people. I'd traveled to probably 55 different countries before I turned 13, and have since backpacked to another 40, 45 or so. So I've had these opportunities in my life that, contrasted with kids beside me in my elementary public school, made me significantly sometimes feeling guilty for the opportunities I'd had, and one struggles with that, and you sort of look for a way to make meaning out of it. But my parents raised me with a sense that, well, as we all know, you don't define yourself by what you get from the world, you define yourself by what you have to offer the world. And the idea of doing right by the chances I'd gotten was inculcated in me from an early age. So saying politics wasn't supposed to be for me. I respected my father for doing it. I knew the kind of impact he'd had in his life on people, but I didn't think that getting involved in politics was going to be right for me. So I decided with great pride that I was going to take a different path, and I was going to become a teacher. And that's exactly what I did. I became a teacher in my 20s, taught mostly French and math, but in the teaching profession now, the more versatile you can be, the better it is. So I taught everything from kindergarten to grade 12 pre-law, and enjoyed it immensely. This was a tangible way for me of having a real impact on the world around me. The students I had, and the help I gave them in changing their worldviews and empowering themselves to understand difficult concepts, sure, but mostly to feel like they had agency and authority and a perspective that was all their own on the world, was a really key part for me of my own development. Because a good teacher, and I think this does apply to politics, isn't someone who has all the answers. A good teacher is someone who actually helps the students figure out the answers for themselves. Yes, takes difficult concepts and breaks them down and shares them, but in a way that doesn't make them a sage on the stage, makes them very much someone who is empowering the students to then be able to do with this knowledge, this understanding, these new skills, what they can. And I think as I reflected on my role as a teacher, it actually informed my view of what it is to be a politician, because a good politician should be about empowering citizens to be able to take agency and authority over their own lives, to create solutions, to figure out their path, and to be powerful in their lives in shaping the course of their lives, and by extension, the course of their communities. After teaching, I went back to school for a bit to get my science fix. I did a few years of engineering, but I kept getting dragged into advocacy work, activism on environment, on youth issues. And it wasn't until a party convention for my father's party, which would become mine, the Liberal Party of Canada, that I realized that I actually not only was interested and enjoyed politics, but I wasn't without political abilities that, for me, most importantly, were different from the abilities that my father had. The challenge we all face as young people is figuring out what is your path, and so much of it is influenced by either trying to be like your parents, depending on the age and the era you're going through, or to be the opposite of your parents, and you distinguish yourselves in those senses. And for me, it was really important to figure out what my own path was, independently of everyone's expectations or impressions of me, and also independently a little bit of my own expectations and impressions of what I should be or shouldn't be. So it was through actually deciding to get into politics as a relatively young person at 35, and working on the ground in communities, learning the craft by going door to door and talking to Canadians, talking to people in my district about their future, about their fears, about their opportunities, about what they needed, about what they were facing, that I actually learned how to be a politician. Because from my father, I'd seen how to be a prime minister, but how to actually be a representative, a local constituency MP dealing with immigration challenges or pension issues or all the different ways the federal government interconnects with someone's life was a really tangible lesson in politics that I quite frankly relish and value more than just about any other aspect of my upbringing and my education. That opportunity to listen and learn directly from people informed everything else I chose to do in politics and hopefully still does today. Because what I heard from Canadians, what I heard from the folks, not just in my district in Montreal, but right across the country, was that people were worried. People are anxious about the future, were anxious about their kids' future. And it wasn't just sort of a general, oh, I wonder what the future is going to bring. There was something different, and we've seen it over the past couple of decades increase, not just in Canada, but in developed democracies around the world. This sense of anxiety that I think at its very root comes from the sense that perhaps that promise of progress that so many of our societies have successfully built up is starting to break down. And that promise is always that the hard work of one generation will lead to better opportunities and better outcomes for the next generation. That's what drives parents to hope the best for their kids, to work long hours so they can go to good schools and get good opportunities. And that sense that is sort of generalized now that maybe your generation is going to be the first one in history to not have better opportunities, better quality of life than previous generations, is really unsettling. Is a cause to sort of question everything about the social contract, the compact we create within our societies and the stability of those societies. I mean, if you think about it, in Western developed economies, regardless of political parties or ideology, there's been a general approach that has said that pro-growth policies, whether it's tax competitiveness or fiscal discipline or investment in science and innovation or investments in infrastructure or seeking out more trade and better trade deals, would create growth. And it did. But the promise that was sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly stated in that was that growth would be good for everyone. And that's where it broke down. That's where people sort of agreed, okay, you do that, you create growth in the economy, great. And the economies got richer. But the middle class, but hardworking families and people started to see some parts of society do extremely well, and others stalled and even fall behind. And that led to an anxiety and a fear that started to erode the trust we have in our system, in the capacity of our system to deliver. And this is very much the context that we faced in the run-up to the 2015 election. I had a party to the Liberal Party in Canada is sort of the centrist, center-left party. The Conservative parties are further to the right, and there's a new Democratic Party further to the left. And on the right, the government in place was playing up the politics of fear and division. It manifests itself in a few different ways. Mistrust of Muslims, for example, and snitch lines and politics of division around that came up. A sense, again, that the economy worked when you invested more in trickle-down, and they had a lot of tax benefits and advantages given to the wealthiest in the hopes that that would create growth. And really careful politics of personal attacks. I had the largest set of personal attack campaigns against me put on against any leader in the history of Canadian politics. On the left, there was a lot of hooking into the anger and the frustration that people feel about policies that haven't worked for working people and a sense of lashing out, we decided as we were getting squeezed out that the best approach would probably be, instead of trying to position ourselves just in the center, try to elevate the debate. Try and say, instead of, first of all, recognizing the anxieties that people feel, but instead of amplifying them for votes, yeah, you should be outraged, or no, it's their fault, vote for us and we'll blame them. We said, okay, well, let's elevate and allay those fears. Let's focus on solutions to these difficult problems that are not just in Canada but elsewhere around the world, and let's actually try to do something about it by understanding that when we pull together, we have a better option, a better ability to actually solve problems than when we emphasize what divides us. Canada is a country of diversity, of different geographical areas spread out over a landmass larger than the United States, with about 1/10 of the population. So it's very easy to see, just curiosity, how many Canadians are here today? We have a little shout out. All right, good. Good to see you here. Thank you very much for being here. But as you know from your Canadian friends, what part of Canada you're from, what your background is, leads to a tremendous variance in perspectives. We're united around shared values across the country, but the stories are different. And it's always tempting to try and create wedges and divide one area of the country against the other. But one of the things that we saw, and I saw very clearly, is once you get elected through dividing people, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to try and govern in a way that brings people together. So we very much focused on trying to find common ground as we move forward. And we put forward a platform that we've been working on that focused on a number of different things that we thought would pull Canadians together. The first one around the economic anxiety that people are feeling for the future. We said, okay, you know what, instead of trying to play with trickle down, which really doesn't work, we actually, first thing we did, we lowered taxes for the middle class and raised them on the wealthiest 1%. And there were the usual criticisms that that's not going to work. And actually what it's led to, and some of the other things we did, we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7, and we have the lowest unemployment rate in over 40 years in Canada, because we did that, because we did a Canada Child benefit that puts more money in the pockets of families who need it, low-income, middle-income families, to be able to do everything like school supplies and new shoes and after-school activities for their kids, that was means-tested and gives to the lowest income families with a kid under 6 a little over $6,000 a year, tax-free, to help with the costs of raising their kids. We stopped sending the child benefit checks that were universal to the wealthiest families, and move forward on a number of different things, like strengthening our Canada Pension Plan, which is our version of Social Security, in such a way that future generations, this generation that won't necessarily have a corporate benefit plan from a single company by the time you retire, because you'll be doing so many different jobs or even different careers, so that our Social Security net is actually going to meet the needs of future generations, and that's a change we made now. We also put more upfront grants in low and middle income students so that they can go to school, and made sure you don't have to start paying back any student debts until you're making more than $25,000 a year. We took care of our seniors with increases to the guaranteed income supplement. We really focused on trying to make sure that what we were doing was not just giving a little more money into the pockets of people who really needed it and programs to support them, but give people a little more confidence in their future, in their own retirement, and in their kids' future. And that came together very well. People are feeling more confident about their opportunities, but there's still a lot more work to do. One of the things that we had to do a lot of work on, and what I felt hadn't been done well in the past, was make a case for trade. And trade is a bit of a tricky issue. As I said, it's one of those things that we know contributes to growth, but trade on its own doesn't ensure that everyone benefits from the growth that happens. That really depends on the type of trade agreement that's signed. It depends on the government that's looking at it to make sure that the benefits of trade don't just go to the 1% or to the big companies or just to the country's bottom line, but actually impact positively on citizens, on workers, and ensure protections for things like the environment and Indigenous peoples and all those things that people now expect. So there's a lot of grumbling about trade right now, but for me the grumbling isn't about trade specifically, because if we don't have growth, then it becomes very hard to share the pot responsibly in ways that's benefiting people. What we have to look at is the policies and the rules around trade that is going to be beneficial. But we're lucky in Canada around a trade discussion because Canadians inherently and automatically understand, in a general sense, the benefits of trade. We're a country that was founded on trade in fish and furs and forests. We are a country with tremendous natural resources and too small a population to actually draw all the benefits and provide enough of a market for the natural resources we have. So we've always been reliant on trade. And making a case for trade required attention, but wasn't an impossible hill to surmount, particularly because we know how much it has benefited the Canadian economy to have the United States as our closest friend and neighbor. The interconnectedness between our economies, the family connections, the businesses that work back and forth, the cultural and social connections between our countries are as old as our countries themselves. And Canadians get that in a very, very tangible, daily life way. We are super aware of everything going on here in the United States. At all times, regardless of who the president is. But the flip side isn't necessarily true, even for people who have a lot of dealings with Canada. I mean, one of your most infamous Chicagoans, Al Capone, who was as effective an importer of Canadian goods into the US as anyone, once pointed out he didn't even know what street Canada was on. Americans aren't always as aware of Canada as we are of the United States. And that's where I think the discussions we're having around NAFTA and the work we're doing on improving and deepening the economic ties between Canada and the United States involve a little bit of pointing out things that perhaps are taken for granted. Like the fact that the United States sells more goods to Canada every year than you do to China, Japan, and the UK combined. The fact that the state of Illinois sells more goods to Canada every year than it does to their next two biggest international trading partners, China and Mexico. The fact that here in Illinois, over 300,000 jobs are directly related to trade with the United States. The fact that in the agricultural industry across this country, over the past 20 years, trade of agricultural products to Canada has tripled. Trade of agricultural products to Mexico has increased by 5 times. And over these past 20, 25 years, trade of corn to the two NAFTA partners has multiplied by a factor of 7. So we know that there are tremendous benefits, and perhaps the biggest one is over the past 25 years that NAFTA has been in place, the American economy has added 33 million net new jobs, which is almost the entire population of Canada, of 36 million. So it's a really big number for us anyway. So the idea and the facts are that our economies have thrived over the past 25 years under NAFTA. At the same time, absolutely, we need to modernize. We need to improve NAFTA. We need to look at, as we've said a number of times, bringing in better labor standards, to make sure that we are sharing the benefits of trade and the opportunities that come with it with workers and with families and communities that actually work so hard. We need to make sure that we're protecting Indigenous rights. We need to make sure we're doing a better job of putting opportunities for women at the center of our economies, and trade can be another vehicle for doing that. I am, as you've probably heard, a proud feminist. And it's not just a moral position. Okay, you can applaud that. But it's not just a moral position because it's the right thing to do or the nice thing to do, or in some areas a popular thing to do, but not in others. But actually because it's the smart thing to do. If women are not able to fully contribute to our economy the way they are able to, the way they certainly would want to be able to, in many cases, then we are not performing as communities, as an economy, as well as we should. When there are systemic barriers to success, we all are the worse off for it. So ensuring that we look at inclusion, ensuring that we're looking at how to specifically make sure in any deal we sign, including an updated NAFTA, we're putting women's success at the heart of our success. That is the kind of thing that people are looking to mechanisms to do, and good trade deals can be absolutely that. One of the other things that people worry about on trade is, oh, are we giving too much power to companies to sue other countries' governments when they do things like protecting the environment? That's something that often comes up, and it was actually a big issue that came up when we first started in government 2 years ago, and we were looking to conclude the Canada-Europe Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. And that question of ISDS, which is investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, was really at the heart of it. And we made sure that we brought in more progressive elements to that trade deal that explicitly says that no, companies cannot sue governments that decide, no, for environmental reasons, you cannot continue with that investment, or governments that bring in tougher labor standards that don't allow companies to make the profits they might want to do if there were no labor standards. Making sure that we're protecting governments' abilities to do the kinds of things that their citizens expect them to do can actually be and should actually be at the heart of the kinds of negotiations and discussions we have around trade. And that's exactly the approach that we have on NAFTA and on trade. This is an opportunity for us to listen to the anxiety and the concerns that people feel and make a case that if you do want to help ordinary citizens, you do want to help the middle class, you do want to make people who feel anxious about the future, not just for their kids, but for their own jobs with the arrival of automation and AI and robotics and the changing workplace and the movements towards different kinds of economies that are much more service-based, and the anxieties of skill retraining and going back to school and so much disruption that we know is on the horizon. If we can think deliberately and meaningfully about how we make sure that people are included in the growth and in the success that will come from better trade, then we're on the right track. And if we don't, if we continue to just exacerbate differences or throw up our hands and say, yes, trade is bad, then we're going to find ourselves in a place where growth will slow down. There won't be the kinds of economic opportunities for citizens, for anyone. Yes, we'll be punishing the multinationals and the 1% and the countries that, bottom line, that are benefiting from trade. But of course, by extension, we'll be punishing every citizen of that country, because we won't have the kind of innovation and opportunities we have that we can create. And the other element to it, of course, is with trade, with freer movement of goods and indeed people across borders, and the sharing and challenging of ideas, of disruption of industries that come from the to and fro of a freer, more open marketplace, is you end up getting a diversity of people, of ideas, of solutions that ends up benefiting. One of the great things about Canada is that we're a country that was founded on two very distinct and, at the time, very contradictory identities, English and French, who came and settled in Canada, were deeply influenced and informed by Indigenous peoples who'd lived on our land for millennia, on this land for millennia. But at the same time, from the very beginning, we had to accept that someone who was totally different from us, I come from a French-Canadian Catholic family with ties back to France, was just as much a Canadian as someone who was, English-Canadian, Protestant, English by descent, still, had a picture of the Queen over the wall. That incompatibility in identity, which certainly was a fault line early on in our society, ended up, with time, morphing into one of our great advantages. In Canada, because there is no typical Canadian, we often talk about the difference between the American melting pot as a metaphor versus the Canadian mosaic, where everyone does get to keep a certain different identity, whether you're a Polish Canadian or whether your ancestors or grandparents were Indigenous, or whether you came over from Asia in the early 1900s. There is a reflection that Canada isn't defined by a single shared identity, but we're much more defined by a single shared set of values. And emphasizing that and drawing on that and recognizing that diversity is and must be a source of strength is something that is a great and precious asset in our country, in our countries, that we do need to make sure we're protecting. Because the arrival of different perspectives, of people coming from different parts of the world to try and build a better life for themselves and their kids, is what has created these extraordinarily successful countries of Canada and the United States. And how we make sure that we keep that, while, of course, getting the balance right on security, on bringing in people that we can then make sure have pathways to success, how we deal with the opportunities for everyone to really succeed through policy, through initiatives, through programs, is at the center of what we're doing. And one of the things that has been core to me all my life and in my way I look at politics and the way politics has shaped me has been the fact that every step of the way, whether starting as a teacher or then a youth activist helping run Canada's National Youth Service Program, to working on environmental causes, has been my opportunity all my life to be surrounded by young people, challenged by young people, and fold young people into the debate and the discussion. And in the 2015 election, I was told many times, and it was common wisdom, that young people just don't vote in Canada. There is a lower percentage of turnout in our elections by young people, and it had been steadily declining faster than in other age cohorts. And it was seen as a bit of a fool's game to try and get young people involved in politics or even interested in politics, because politics was changing. And absolutely, it's true. There is less of a rigid identification with a given political party in our societies today. And young people are the perfect example of that. I mean, the idea that, your parents voted one way and your grandparents voted one day, or your community votes one way, and therefore you're locked in and almost identified by being here, either a Democrat or a Republican, in Canada, any one of the different parties, held a lot less sway. And I used to find, as I'd get out and talk with young people in universities and in high schools, or in organizations and groups, that talk of partisan politics immediately turned them off. Even if they agreed with what I was saying, if I brought in an element, and they're just bad because they're bad, they'd tune out right away. People are much more interested in the substance and don't feel like they have to identify themselves in a little box as being red or blue or whatever. And that, for me, was an extraordinary opportunity. Because young people getting a bad rap for being cynical or disconnected is something that we've always heard. But when you spend any time speaking with young people, not just young people involved in an extraordinary institute of politics like this one, you're exceptional for your interest in politics, but those 10 friends you have back at home who would never be caught dead at a political event or in a political class, still care deeply about the world and about their role in it. The frustration and the cynicism that's sometimes there comes from not feeling like you actually have the capacity to shape that world. So for me, getting young people involved in politics wasn't just a nice way of getting a few more progressive votes away from the conservatives that were currently in power in Canada. It was a way of actually drawing agents of change for whom change isn't as scary. Because young people from high school to university to your first job to starting a family, the transitions you're going through in your life are massive and would be incredibly destabilizing for any adult who thought they'd found stability and was thinking of the long term as a simple extension of the short term. So getting young people's voices, both as challengers and dreamers of a different world and ready to roll up their sleeves and desperate to just actually have an impact in shaping the world, was hugely exciting for me and was key to actually changing the nature of political discourse in Canada. Because young people don't so much care as much about the partisan identity aspect of it, and they're really just focused on the substance. And the substance in a way that is naturally long-term. You know that what the world looks like in 50 years is going to have a direct impact on you, and how you actually weigh into making that difference matters today. We have, as a world right now, as a society, an awful lot to learn from all of you, from your approach, from your dynamism, but also from your willingness to challenge the way things have always been done and say, why can't they be totally different? Why can't you speak to me like an intelligent human being instead of pretending that you're going to be able to scare me into voting one way or another, or anger me into voting one way or another? And that idea of civil, intelligent, rational discourse in politics is one that young people like you are demanding more than just about anyone else. And that, when we look at all the challenges we're facing all around the world, is the one thing that gives me more cause for hope than just about anything else. The fact that anywhere I go, I have the opportunity to listen to learn from, and to be inspired by young folks like you, for whom politics isn't automatically a dirty word. And the idea of service and engagement and shaping your community for the better is at the heart of what you hope to be in the coming years, but mostly and more importantly, what you hope to do in the coming years. So I thank you for your interest, I thank you for your activism, I thank you for your hard work, and mostly I thank you for everything you're going to be doing in the coming years. Merci beaucoup, mes amis. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much. I can't think of a better message for this occasion and this group. Part of the tradition of the Institute of Politics, however, is that you get scrutinized by these young people as well. And they have sent dozens of questions, and I've filtered a few here. And not surprisingly, because you said that you've been following American politics, let me get to the elephant in the room right away. Grayan Sotir, a fourth-year student, writes, "How has Donald Trump challenged your agreeable diplomatic demeanor? How have you learned to speak with and deal with him, and has this been different from your approach to other world leaders?" And Emily Waters, a first year, said, "Would you categorize the Canadian-American relationship differently now under the Trump administration than you would when Barack Obama was president?"
First of all, international relations, I learned this from my dad, it was one of the tangible things I learned about politics, is often about interpersonal relations, and how I engage with the different leaders really very much depends on how best to engage with them and what the particular situation is. So yes, I deal differently with Donald Trump than I would with Emmanuel Macron or Theresa May or with Barack Obama, because
So what's the secret sauce?
The secret to getting along is always to find common ground. And at the center of the relationship between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President is the fact that our countries and our peoples get along so well and are so closely intertwined that the relationship is much bigger and much deeper than the ideologies or perspectives of whoever happens to be Prime Minister of Canada and whoever is occupying the White House. So starting with that as a beginning point, that the relationship is bigger than either of the two of us, is grounding and useful. And the second piece of it for me is that Canadians elected me to do a job, to make sure that they have a better future, a brighter future, that their kids have opportunities, and that their country reflects their values and their priorities in the way we go. Because that is my job, that dictates everything I do. So Canadians expect me to have a constructive relationship with the United States, a constructive relationship with the president, whoever that president is, and that's exactly what I do. At the same time, yes, Canadians also expect me to stand up for Canadian values, to stand up for Canadian interests, and that's exactly what I intend to do. And standing up for Canadian values and having a constructive relationship with the president doesn't have to be a direct contradiction, because there are lots of things on which we can find common ground. He got elected on a promise to make America work for people who'd been left out, which is not entirely dissimilar from the commitment that I made to try and help the middle class in Canada.
Broadly constructed, yes.
We have differences in how to do it, for sure.
Let me ask you a political question, though, because you pointed out the two kind of imperatives, getting along with America and representing Canadian interests. There was a poll last week that showed the approval rating for American leadership at 20% in Canada now. That's down from 60 a year ago. I think it was the steepest drop of any country. What political problems does that cause for you in trying to strike deals with the President of the United States?
I think.
And why do you think that is, by the way, that 40% drop?
I'm not going to wonder about things, but Canadians know. Well, no, Canadians know how important a good relationship with the United States is. We know how much NAFTA has benefited Canada, but we also are very knowledgeable about how NAFTA has benefited the United States. We're talking about 9 million jobs directly linked to trade with Canada across the United States. It's good for Canada. It's good for the United States, and we are legitimately concerned about the future of NAFTA because the president has said that he's not sure that it's a good thing. So when Canadians see me engaging constructively, collaboratively, but firmly at the negotiating table on NAFTA, saying, look, we know there are ways to modernize and improve NAFTA in a way that will create a win-win-win when we include Mexico. There is a path, absolutely, for that. But we are not going to take a win-loss just for the sake of getting a deal. And I've been very, very clear. We're going to expect a good deal, a fair deal, because quite frankly, there is no country in the world that has a greater vested interest in the United States being successful than Canada. Because no matter how good we're doing in Canada, if your economy faces troubles, we get, when you sneeze, we catch a cold. I mean, we're so interlinked that absolutely we want to make sure that it's a good deal for the United States, because that's part of making a good deal for Canada, and that's what we're focused on.
So on this point, Andrea Ochoa, who is a first year, writes, Prime Minister Trudeau, you stated several days ago that Canada is willing to walk away from NAFTA if the United States proposes a bad deal. Under what terms would you expect all three countries to be able to successfully renegotiate the trade deal? And let me repurpose this and ask you, what are the red lines that you simply can't cross?
Well, I think we've been clear that there's a number of things that we have deep concerns about. One of the benefits of NAFTA is the stability that it provides in terms of investments and building supply chains that crisscross the border. I mean, there are situations in which an auto part might crisscross the border 6 times before making it into a completed vehicle, and that's good for our economy. It's good for your economy. It just makes a lot of sense. Anything that provides a level of uncertainty, like a sunset clause, for example, to businesses is something that we have grave reservations about. But what I've said is, and I think the language of walking away has been taken as mirroring some of the things that the President has said. We have a different approach on that. It is that we will continue to engage thoughtfully, constructively at the negotiating table, because we know there is a good deal to be had. And I'm not going to negotiate it in public here, but we know we can work towards a good deal. But we also know that we will not be pushed into accepting any old deal, and no deal might very well be better for Canada than a bad deal. And being firm on that is, I think, what Canadians expect of us.
Let me ask you, because you are a close observer, then you know that the President's campaign was very much propelled by his anti-trade rhetoric, anti-NAFTA rhetoric. We sit in the industrial Midwest, where many people feel like they were disadvantaged by trade deals in the way that you described in your talk. Are the political incentives aligned properly for him? Or isn't there something, as you're a practicing politician, isn't there something in it for him to walk away and say, I kept my promise, I walked away from NAFTA?
The problem is the disruption on millions of American jobs, of American families, when suddenly the supply chains that they're part of that exist between Canada and the US, and in some cases Mexico, get more difficult, get more uncertain. Thickening at the border means in the short term, even if theoretically there is a better opportunity for a long-term deal, in the short term, that's a lot of families out of work, suffering in a way that I think would be far worse politically. And the challenge we have is not trade deal versus no trade deal. It's how do we make sure that we're benefiting citizens and workers who don't feel like they've been properly supported or cared for over the past years. And the right trade deal and proper updating and modernization and improvement. To take a concrete example, the way we're pushing for improved labor standards around NAFTA is not something that will massively impact the Canada-US dynamic, because we have very similar labor standards and very similar approaches and very similar economies. But if we can raise labor standards in Mexico, then there is less of an incentive to move companies there for the extreme low wages, and at the same time, the companies that are there with higher wages will create a consumer base that will do a better job of actually buying products from Canada and the United States, and will create more economic growth there. So these are all problems that are not intractable. They are problems that require us to sit down and figure out the best way forward for our citizens. And that's very much what we're engaged in.
Did the U.S. Make a mistake walking away from the TPP? You just joined the successor agreement to the TPP, but that represents 15% of the world market, as opposed to 40% if the U.S. had stayed in. So less market power there. Did the U.S. it certainly disadvantages the group. Did it disadvantage itself?
You know, I'm not going to opine on the U.S. decisions on it, but I've made no bones about the fact that I think trade is and will remain a motor for growth. The issue is not trade, no trade. The issue is what kind of trade and how do we make sure people are benefiting from trades. And what we did in changes to the now comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership involved things like protection on intellectual property rights, protection around some of our cultural industries, because our cultural industries, particularly in Quebec, where language is a really important identifier and driver of identity, we're worried about the impact that it could have on those sorts of things. We've gotten certain improvements to the approach on autos to make sure that our auto workers are going to do better in the long term under the CPTPP. So we've looked at ways of improving the outcomes in a way that, yes, there are people in Canada who have concerns about a trade deal with Asia and what that's going to have as an impact on their industries, on their jobs. But we also know that the growing economies of Asia are a pivot we have to make as a world to engage with. And I think a trade deal that includes countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others is a good thing for Canada. And that's why we moved forward and why we're still hopeful that in the coming years, the U.S. will choose to join.
Yang Xiang, a first year, asked this. Many people compared your official visit to China last December to Trump's visit last November, saying that your commitment to progressive ideas such as human rights, the rule of law, and gender equality was considered sensitive, therefore not received well by the Chinese government. In contrast, President Trump did sign multi-billion-dollar deals with Beijing while ignoring U.S. traditional values, which his predecessors had upheld. The question is how to engage with authoritarian leaders in this increasingly multipolar world without falling into a credibility trap in exercising moral leadership.
It's always a balance. We know that it's easy to, one path is to sort of sit back and say, I'm not going to engage with anyone who doesn't share our values and our progressive ideals. And maybe larger economies can get away with that, but Canada as a country doesn't really get a lot of leverage if we say, well, we're not going to talk to you until you change your system, is not our path for actually bringing about improvements and changes that will meaningfully improve outcomes for people. So we feel that thinking about how we engage in a responsible way, that, yes, looks for economic opportunities for our citizens. I mean, we're very interested in some of the opportunities for our small businesses, for our agricultural producers to sell into the growing Chinese middle-class market. But we're not going to back off on saying, look, we believe that a free, informed populace is essential through a free, independent media. These are essential pillars of success and freedom in society, and we're not going to flinch too much on that. We're going to respect that you have a different view on it, but we're going to find ways where we can stand true to our values and create benefits for our country and perhaps some benefits for your citizens that will see that there are other ways of doing things that might be better down the road.
It came up again this week in the story that surfaced that Canada is selling 16 combat helicopters to the Philippines. You were very critical of the Duterte regime. They didn't much appreciate it when you were there on that same trip to Asia. But it's been criticized by some human rights advocates and some of your political opponents. Do you have any concerns about giving him weaponry that could be used against his own citizens?
Absolutely. We have very clear rules around who and what we can sell, either arms or potential military vehicles like helicopters, and controls on what they intend to be used for and checks on how they are used. And we're going to make sure before this deal or any other deal goes through that we are abiding by the rules and the expectations that aren't just sort of values, but that are actual rules that Canadian governments have to follow when we're looking at deals like this, whether it's selling equipment to foreign countries, from arms to whatever, or on investments by different countries in Canada to make sure that they fit within the security framework that we want, that there's not national security interests, and that they're in a net benefit position for Canadian citizens, for workers.
So you're satisfied in this case that this
We're still in the process of looking at it.
I see. This issue of balance, you ran a campaign that was familiar to me. It was more of a movement than a campaign, and it inspired a great deal of idealism. And governing is tougher. So on an issue like the environment, I mean, you have a very strong issue on the environment. You also have a country that extracts energy, and you're dealing with issues of pipelines in your country. How do you make those decisions? Where do you draw the line? You know, we had a big controversy in this country about the Keystone Pipeline to bring oil from the oil sands of Alberta down to the port of Louisiana and so on. What is the standard you use? How do you make that calculus? And how do you keep from disappointing people who say, gee, I thought he'd be stronger than that?
Well, first of all, in government, you're going to have to make choices that some people are going to disagree with. And what people look at, is, well, what choices have you made, and also what is the underlying thinking, what are the values that drove those decisions. We ran on a platform that said, you know what, those to our left and to our right both say that you have to choose. It's either the environment or the economy. You can't do them both together. But I know, and most people know, that the only way to build the strong economy of the future is to make sure we're protecting the environment at the same time. So that's a nice thing to say, and it's a fundamental principle we live by. But when you actually get around to making those decisions, there were a number of pipeline proposals we looked at. A couple of them we turned down, or one of them we turned down, the Northern Gateway. One of them we approved, the Kinder Morgan TMX pipeline. The people who wanted all pipelines were furious at us for refusing the Northern Gateway. And the people who wanted no pipelines were furious at us, not for turning down the Northern Gateway, but for approving the TMX pipeline. So we made a decision not just looking for a Goldilocks solution, but we actually know that for the first time in Canada's history, we were able to put together a concrete plan, not just targets to reach our climate emission reductions, but a plan to reach those. And that plan involved different things. It involved a national price on carbon pollution, national standards in every region of the country that will actually be met and reduce our carbon emissions. But the flip side of that is we're actually going to get our oil resources to new markets across the Pacific. We'll do it safely and securely through a pipeline, which is better than doing it by rail or by trucks. And the folks on the right are upset there's a national price on carbon. The folks on the left are upset we approved a single pipeline. We actually approved more than one pipeline, but we're doing that because there's a balance. And on top of that, we're putting in world-class oceans protection to make sure that the BC coast is safe. So these things all fit together, and any one can find issue with one of those decisions. And what I am counting on and hoping on, and I think reasonably confident about, because I know Canadians and I know we're reasonable people will get the big picture we're going at, and that faith in Canadians is one that I am confident in.
I can't let you go without asking you this. We hear a lot in this debate about immigration in our country now from conservatives saying we need a system like Canada. We need a merit-based system. And I read your very fine autobiography, and you were critical of the policies of the conservatives on this. As you said, from the short-sighted restriction of the family unification policy to the mismanagement of the temporary foreign worker program, we are eroding the unique Canadian insight that people come from abroad to find a new life, not just a better job. We should see the newly arrived as community builders and potential citizens, not just as employees. Are you shocked or surprised to see your country held up as an example for why America should cut its own legal immigration?
Oh, I think what we've done as a country, but quite frankly, the story of North America's success is the story of people coming here from all around the world and building better lives for themselves. A number of decades ago, we shifted away from judging immigrants on country of origin, instead looked at the skills they brought, looked at their level of education, looked at a points-based system. Well, if you could speak English or French, you'd have more advantages, and that allowed us to get away from a ethnic or geographically based process.
That's what's being proposed, is a shift to that kind of system.
Well, for us, that system is part of what has ensured that while part of the world or much of the world is turning away from immigration, Canadians, whether you're anywhere on the political spectrum, mainstream political spectrum in Canada, there is no anti-immigration party that has a single seat in our parliament, for example. We have a broad consensus that immigration has been good for us. And the most important responsibility I have as Prime Minister towards Canadians and immigration is to protect that positive view of immigration. And that means continuing to bring over good people. Yes, we have a merit-based system, but we also have a refugee system that is not merit-based, that brings in people who are among the most vulnerable because, yes, they come with a dearth of language skills or education. They come from war-torn places where their kids are 12 years old, have never seen the inside of a classroom once, and their path to integration is longer. But we've seen it, we have studies on it, but you also have that sense of the stories we hear in our communities, people who come to our countries with nothing from devastation are the ones who are most passionate about working incredibly hard, not just for themselves and their families, but to build strong communities and to give back to this country that gave their kids an opportunity for the future. And that has been an incredible lever of success in Canada. Canadians get that, and lots of Americans get that. So protecting that and demonstrating that we can continue to make that work without compromising on security, on making sure that we're investing in the kind of training and language acquisition that is going to give them the tools to succeed, remains an incredibly important element of what Canada's doing well.
You accepted 35,000, is that right?
A little over 40, a little over 40.
And how are they being assimilated?
Some of them are doing great. Some of them are finding it really tough. One of the things we have that's great around refugees is a private sponsorship system where church groups, community groups, individual families can sponsor a family, help pay for the services they're going to need in that first year, and mostly provide them support and a network that is going to help them with their integration. And that connection means the privately sponsored refugees tend to do better, quicker than the government-sponsored ones, who are usually the most vulnerable of the vulnerable who we bring over. So there's a mix of success paths, but Canadians are rightly very proud of it. And it's not something this government did.
No political backlash? It seemed like you've had to deal with some of that.
Oh, of course there's always a little bit. I mean, you get stories of backlashes and individual problems. But by and large, Canadians are very cognizant of the potential and the contribution and the rightness of welcoming people who are fleeing the most difficult things imaginable and try to help out. And there are going to be 60 million displaced persons around the world in the coming years. So no country can accept them all. But if everyone does a little bit more, you make a significant dent in the problem. And you also look at ways of solving the challenges that led to those migrations.
That hasn't been the tenor of the policy here for the last year or so.
Continues to be our approach.
Yes, you sent out
Unapologetically.
you sent out a tweet, in fact, at the time that the president did his travel ban, saying to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. # welcome to Canada. That seemed to have a message associated with it.
It's an emphasis of Canadian values, the way Canadians expect it, but it's also a recognition, and people have interpreted it in a number of different ways, but it's about refugees. If you're fleeing terror, persecution, war, that makes you a refugee. It's not just an economic migrant looking for better opportunities from a poor country, for example. It's someone who literally has no country or no protections or no state to protect them. They're not a citizen of anywhere anymore. That's what refugees are, and that's where, as Canada is a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, we have an obligation and we have an understanding that welcoming in people who are refugees, who have absolutely nothing to fall back on, is an important part of our strength.
Finally, in keeping with your remarks about the taking on public service, running for office, doing those things for a purpose beyond simply holding that office. Ronan Shasky, a second-year student here, asks, is there a cause for which you would sacrifice your political career, and what is it?
My kids. I'm in politics not in spite of the fact that I have kids. I'm in politics because I have kids. And yes, I'm here tonight, so I'm not at home with them back in Ottawa. And that cost on me and on them for not having their dad as home as often as they'd like and having to share him with the country in many ways has to come with an understanding for me that what I am doing is going to lead to them and their generation having a better life and a better future. And if ever the time came where I didn't think the cost was worth it, that I wasn't creating enough of a better world to justify all the time I don't get to spend with them at recitals and soccer games, then I might re-question what I'm doing.
It's bad enough that they have to share you with your country. Now they're sharing you with our country as well. But we so appreciate them doing it, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.